Hello, welcome back to a special edition of Inside the Birds, where we're focusing on analytics, and that means we've got Sam Finkel, our analytics expert, with us to continue a series that we started where we've been looking at this year's NFL draft eligible players. We started with edges, and now we're going to do interior defensive line, and we're going to measure. Sam has got charts that measure their production versus their athleticism, how this class compares among each other, how it compares among the last 4 years of first round picks, and how that compares along the last 4 years of top 100 picks to just see what really jumps out. I thought in our last episode on edge rushers, Sam, was really interesting. I mean, we found a guy like Donovan Ezraku, who I don't know if everybody's talking about as much as, say, an Abdul Carter or even a JTT or some other guys, is really a guy who falls into the quadrant that you want to be in, which is being highly athletic and highly productive, which is what NFL teams are always looking for.
Absolutely. 100% agree.
And then in this episode, we're going to move from same thing, but edges. We're going to go to interior defensive linemen. You can call them defensive tackles, but people call them 3 techniques. There's 0 techniques. These are guys that come in a little bit more different shapes and sizes and roles than edges. But bottom line, NFL teams are still looking for the best athletes who are also the most productive players.
But I will take that as an opportunity to caveat that because they range so much, it is very hard to project, whether that's contract valuation, which we saw before with Milton Williams, or due to like success, right? Because there's so much variance between the body types, between the responsibilities, more so than some other positions, it makes it hard to project.
Absolutely.
So take it a little bit with a grain of salt. All these tools are just tools.
And as we always say, you're right, not the be all to end all. Just as you just mentioned, a great tool, and certainly a tool NFL teams use. We talk about the Eagles and their analytics staff and how much they rely on it and how it's helped them find players that sort of diamonds in the rough because they felt like a Jalix Hunt, who appears to be like he's going to be one. So when we look at the defensive lineman, the first chart here, it's already different than the one we did with edges, Sam. And I want you to explain this green line and why it's so high on the why it looks more like a T than an actual cross compared to the edge ones.
Yeah. So there's a couple reasons why. First off, Milton Williams and Kalijah Cansey are the 2 biggest problems. So Milton Williams recorded a 95 athleticism score, and Kalijah Cansey recorded a 96 athleticism score, and they were drafted in the last 4 years.
Right.
And the issue is we're doing an average of the last 4 years. So when you look at that, it forces that really the athleticism is the issue here, right? So the ones that have been drafted in the first round have extremely high athleticism, the likes of which we have not seen in this class.
Yeah, I mean, like, think about it. This line shows here that the average first round interior defensive lineman athletically tested at a score of about 88. Is that correct?
It was like 88.2 or something like that.
88.2. And not only that, they were fairly productive from a score about 76, 77. So yeah, that's why this chart looks the way it doesn't look like a quadrant chart. It looks like one half or the other chart. It's going to be hard to fall in any of these 4 because, as you just said, as nice as these interior defensive linemen are, they're not Kalijah Canseys and they're not Milton Williams. They're not freakish athletes.
For sure. And that's going to change, right? This year, you're going to see probably 3 or 4 guys drafted in the first round potentially at this position. And so the average probably is it is going to move down when we do this next year.
Yeah, certainly. So what the NFL teams will do clearly is, and again, athleticism is a be all to end all, especially at this position where you can be a real good lunch pail guy and do well, right? They'll look for the most productive players who are also, pretty good athletes. And I guess what really jumps out is sort of how Abdul Carter jumped out from everybody else in the edges, is that Mason Graham up around 94 in production out of Michigan. Defensive tackle, far and above. Even WalterNolen, who's second, is around like 86. So there's a pretty wide gulf in the production between Mason Graham and WalterNolen and then everyone else.
Yeah, and Mason Graham as a better athlete than WalterNolen. So at least in terms of the testing. So I think Mason Graham is clearly the best interior defensive lineman in this draft, and probably will be selected as such.
Yeah. What do you make of guys like CJ West, Tonka Hemingway, and Zeke Biggers? I mean, these guys are incredible athletes, but they're just not as productive.
Yeah, and I mean, look, they're not necessarily, those guys are not first round talents, so I think it would be unfair to necessarily look at them as such. But if you look at them in the top 100, which is the purple chart, or the average drafted, which is the red chart, they fall in this hidden gem category, and it makes sense for teams to take a shot on these extremely talented athletes who just didn't produce. And again, production is so hard at, especially at defensive tackle, because what does production actually look like, right? I mean,
Right.
it's so hard to capture your value as an interior defender, which is what makes this position so difficult to analyze.
Yeah. I think it shows also once you get past like Mason Graham, right, who's going to go high, and then WalterNolen will be a first rounder. There's still some pretty good value as you look at the cluster of who's at least, forget the athletic testing, but at least productive guys like Talik Williams and Derek Harmon, Darius Alexander, Kenneth Grant, also from Michigan, TJ Sanders, I believe from South Carolina, if I'm not mistaken. They're all pretty productive players here, and for one reason or other, maybe they're bigger body types and they don't test as well. In fact, Dion Walker, right? That guy out of Kentucky, I think he's
Got
like
Kentucky,
yeah, I think he's 330 pounds. So to show you the diversity of weight and shape at interior versus edge, it's kind of hard to there's only a few Jordan Davises out there in the world. It's kind of hard to blow it up athletically when you're that big of space eater, but he's a productive player.
right? And speaking of Jordan Davis, you'll see in a little bit, we have him mapped as part of it. Honestly, just if you just go down, you can see the interlay. Jordan Davis fits in that hidden gem category.
Yeah.
Extremely, extremely athletic. Did not produce particularly well. I mean, again, it's particularly well as a relative term, right? He's not that far from the average first round production. But as we have seen from his Eagles, career so far, he does have some production issues and staying on the field, but extremely, extremely high percentile athlete.
Right. Now we talked about the Georgia sort of context in edge rushers where maybe you don't worry about production because they're so talented, especially up front, that all right, so maybe somebody else got the sack and you didn't, but you caused the pressure, or like the production check, because Jalen Carter, theoretically, as you superimposed it here onto this year's draft, right? Jalen Carter, a better athlete, but not as productive as you would say as WalterNolen and Mason Graham. But I guarantee it's going to be a struggle for Mason Graham and WalterNolen to be as productive early on in their careers in the NFL as Jalen Carter was last year, because Jalen Carter played at an all-pro level last year.
Well, yeah, Jalen Carter might be one of the best, young players in the league, regardless of position. And that goes to show you that, like, these charts are fallible, right? I mean, if you look at a first round grade for Jalen Carter in the past 4 years, he falls in that, high floor, not high ceiling, when inarguably he is a high ceiling and high floor player. He's a blue chip player.
Right.
So I think that's an important thing to, acknowledge at this point as we're discussing it.
Sure. Again, I see a lot of, Howard Cross, good D tackle out of Notre Dame, Kenneth Grant out of Michigan. Greg Cosell had some nice things to say about, who was it? TJ Sanders, I believe it was. So there's some good value. It looks like they said this was the strong position of the draft. It may not be the most athletic freak of nature, but certainly strong from a production standpoint.
100%. And honestly, even Darius Alexander, who is, behind the production line in the first round pick, is still probably a good first round pick or early second round pick.
Right. Now, when we get to the purple draft, things start to normalize themselves, right? Because now this is this year's class of interior linemen versus the top 100 selections over the last 40 years. So now you're talking about first, second, and third round picks, and that athleticism line goes all the way down to a more manageable 77, 78 production
which is
line.
still pretty high, by the
Oh,
way.
yeah, yeah, very high, very high.
But definitely a little bit more, palatable.
Right. Speaks highly of Mason Graham here. I mean, he's clearly sort of the leader of the pack. It feels like no matter what you do, WalterNolen's not really catching him in that regard as far as when you widen the lens or narrow it.
100%. Yeah. And I just think that goes to speak to who Mason Graham is as a player. And I just think he is the Abdul Carter of this position. As weird as because just comparing it to what we did last time, there's a clear number one in this position.
Right, just without the freakish athleticism. But again, on the inside, I mean, you just don't find the same type of guys on the inside as the outside.
Yeah.
Trying to remember the last, like not Jordan Davis, but the last like 3 technique who just was blue. WalterNolen is actually considered a pretty good athlete, but even in these show that he's not like the greatest athlete of his position over the last 5 to 10 years.
Right.
All right. Let's go now juxtapose with the Eagles again. And this is again this is now top 100 picks over the last 4 years.
Yep. And as you can see, now Jalen Carter is that blue chip player that we all know he is to be. So, and this is where it gets really interesting because the only other one that fits there is Darius Alexander. And honestly, arguably, Tyleik Williams and Mason Graham are there too. I think I did count them as there because they are essentially there. But Darius Alexander is cleanly and clearly in that category. So he probably is one of my favorite interior defensive lineman prospects.
Could be a guy, if not, I know it seems like WalterNolen was a little bit of a hot name around the Eagles, but Darius Alexander is interesting because he's a Toledo guy, and the Eagles struck gold in getting Quinyon Mitchell last year, and there were always questions, right, about performance of a guy from Toledo in the NFL. Now, and then some of this has to be you see Darius Alexander falling on the higher side, the better side of production, but you also know that comes in the MAC conference. But if you're a believer that, hey, if Quinyon Mitchell can do it, then this is a well-coached organization and a good team in Toledo, then Darius Alexander should be able to transition as well.
Yeah, and I think that is the perspective of Eagles leadership, at least at this point.
Yeah.
Especially after how successful, like you said, Q was.
Right. And I think it helps him that he's both, when you expand it more, that he's both on the high end of production and athleticism. He's above average in that, he falls in the upper right quadrant for both. All right. So now we'll just take a bigger look. Ty Robinson from Nebraska with the leader in total pressures for this group. How about that?
Kind of interesting, right?
Yeah. Is he I know they have a couple of guys up front. One of them is very undersized. That might be their edge. I don't know what Ty Robinson's. Do you have his measurables in front?
I'll pull it up right now.
While you're looking at that, Omar Norman Lott from Tennessee.
That's a guy I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about. So let me get Ty Robinson really quick. He is 6'5", 288.
Yeah, 288 for a. I mean, I get it as so let's get this clear. He's a 3 technique. He's not a 0. He's not a no shade. He's a upfield burst type of interior defensive lineman.
Yes.
So he better have those kind of total pressures if you're weighing 288.
Agreed. But Omar Norman Lott is a guy I kind of wanted to talk about because he has the highest sacks per snap rate and the highest pressures per snap rate. Again, at 3.27 per 100 or 3.27% and 13.1% or 13.1 sacks per 100 snaps relatively.
Right. Now, I guess I would ask, though, on just 400 total snaps, was he not used a whole lot in Pat? Was he in a rotation? What's his size?
Yeah. So again, it's so hard. I went with the same formula that we did with edge rushers when we just looked at pass rush snaps, and it really does a poor job at capturing all the value of interior defensive linemen because a lot of their game comes in the run. And so it's hard to kind of capture that without looking at tackles, and then not every tackle is the same, and so I wanted to stick with the basic formula that we already had, but it is important to note that it's not indicative of his entire game or any of these prospects' entire game.
Got it.
Let me get his size real quick for you.
While you do that, I mean, it's clear, as we've been discussing in this show, Mason Graham, Darius Alexander, Talik Williams, Ohio State. I mean, these guys have a great deal of snaps playing the position. Their pressure numbers are good. Sacks per snap, good. Although Williams lags behind Alexander and Graham a little bit more. And that checks out to me. I thought he was a pretty good player at Ohio State, but not like this amazing interior pass rusher. But Graham and Alexander give you the whole pack. I mean, Graham and Alexander, and we'll see what happens with the other Michigan kid, Kenneth Grant. But I would think Graham and Alexander are no doubt about it. They're top 15, top 20 guy. I mean, Graham's going to be a top 5 guy. I think Alexander, because of the Toledo background, we'll see how much the Quinyon Mitchell thing has helped him, right? If he can get into the top 10 or 15, because he's certainly from a production and athleticism standpoint right there.
Yeah. And again, like you said, Nolen is still a guy that probably will be within that first to second round range too.
Right. WalterNolen and Kenneth Grant right behind.
Yeah. And so Omar Norman Lott is 6'2", 291.
6'2", 291, but only okay. So interesting.
Yeah,
he might have been a late bloomer, but certainly that's why he's in this high ceiling top 100 guy. Perfect kind of guy in round 2 or round 3. Let's go back and look at his athleticism, because I don't remember what his athletic testing was like. Omar Knowledge. So he was fairly high, right?
Yeah.
I mean, his production wasn't as much there, but we mentioned the lack of snaps compared to the others. But I guess there's only 4 other guys maybe that tested higher than him.
Yeah.
That's tested better than him.
Yep.
That's interesting. All right. Got it. That's a name now to watch for the middle rounds. The Eagles, again, big on athletic testing, and they don't mind coaching you up a little bit, from Tennessee. Omar Norman Lott. Anything else jumping out at you before we get out of here?
I think that those are the main ones that I would probably talk about. I mean, we talked a little bit about the Notre Dame kid, Riley Mills. I mean, I feel like he might be another name.
Yeah.
To, at least keep your eye on in the later rounds as well.
Very high pressure per snap right there at 11.24. That's pretty good.
Yeah. But that's probably the only one I would really highlight.
Sure. So Graham, Alexander, Talik Williams, all just earmarked for success. Now, how do you weigh the high ceiling guys versus the guys who are good? Because it almost seems like the guys who fall in the quote safe category, which would be that bottom right quadrant, Nolen, Grant, Harmon, Sanders, Walkers, Collins. I feel like those guys will probably most of them will be a higher drafted player than the high ceiling top 100 guys. Right?
Yeah, I mean, people want safe, right? I mean, right. I think floor is almost more valuable than ceiling at a lot of positions. And I think I think edge is a position where it's the opposite, right? You think that the ceiling is more exciting than the floor, but interior defensive line is a little bit more of a dirty position, so you want a guy that's consistently going to make plays. So I think floor is just more valuable in these positions. And should be valued as such, because you want consistency, you want reliability, and you want somebody that, has produced and can produce, rather than a freak athlete that could develop into something. So I think this is a position where that makes more sense. It
does. Sam, great stuff. Really enjoyed going through the edges and the interior defensive lineman with you. Let's keep doing it. We've got more positions, more prospects, right?
Sounds good to me.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the special edition of Inside the Birds with an analytics viewpoint. For Sam Finkel, I'm Geoff Mosher. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.